I'd like to welcome you to the second to last Historical Heartbeats lecture for the season, Bold, Beautiful Bermudian Women. And I see a lot of them in the room today too, which is terrific. Nice to see you. We're going to be starting up momentarily. The way that we're going to begin, just so there isn't too much disruption once the speakers actually begin, we're going to bring up tables one at a time to help yourselves to the buffet. And so you'll be directed accordingly. So thanks very much, and we'll be starting up shortly. Everybody looks even happier now with a bit of high tea in front of you. Thank you once again for coming today to the second to last Historical Heartbeats, Bold, Beautiful Bermudian Women. And we have some bold, beautiful Bermudian women today who are going to speak about Bermudian women who have been very important to our society, either for cultural reasons, historical reasons. So we're going to have a very good lecture this afternoon. I would like to begin by thanking the Historical Heartbeats Committee. They are a very hard-working group of people who are always extremely supportive. We have Mr. Jim Smith here, Andrew Birmingham, Doreen Aubrey, right over here, and Lucinda Sperling, and Ellen Jane Hollis is somewhere here. And my assistant, Vinay Sims. They're a terrific group of people, and I have to thank them very much for just really helping things to roll along quite smoothly and coming up with some fantastic ideas for lectures. So good to see a great turnout today, and I'm actually going to hand over the mic to our committee member and Bermudian historian, Mr. Jim Smith, who is going to MC for this afternoon. So thank you for coming. And Jim.
Well, good afternoon, bold and beautiful women. There's so many women here. I've been counting the men.
Not so close to the mic, it's too loud.
Yeah, all right.
There we go.
I've been counting the men, and on one hand. Anyway, what I will be doing today is to introduce 4 speakers, and they'll be giving the presentations on bold and beautiful women and the important roles that they played in Bermuda's history. Before I do this, I'd just like to share a few things with you, if that's all right. I won't make it long. Okay, just want to make a few brief comments about the role of Bermuda's women in our history. If you go back in our history, throughout most of the past, women have been restricted, unfortunately, to household duties and rearing their families, and were really prevented from playing a major part in the affairs of the country. And that is part of our history, unfortunately. Also, if you look at the history books, you get very limited references to the women in our history and what part they actually played. Again, that's unfortunate. And I'm sure that you know that in 1944, women were given the vote. It was a property vote, but before that, they couldn't vote, and they couldn't become members of Parliament. And it wasn't until 1948 that we had the first 2 women members of Parliament. And what happened after that, there were a lot of changes. women played a much more important role in our society. They have played an increasingly important role in running the affairs of our country, and that's a big plus. I'm saying this because there are a lot of women here, and I don't want to be downgraded, so, all right? And they've reached high education standards and have risen to several high-level jobs within the community. They're doing a fantastic job. Now, what I would like to do is to introduce our first speaker, and that's Dr. Jolene Bean. Jolene has been teaching history at the Bermuda College for the last 20 years. In fact, 20 years ago, I stopped being a history lecturer there, and she took my place. I'm not going to say what happened after that, but she did take my place. It was positive, too. Now, she obviously has a strong interest in historical topics, and she's also very interested in researching the women's suffrage movement. That was 1923, that's when it started, and as I mentioned before, it wasn't until 1944 that women were given the vote. So for many, many years, they just didn't have a say in the affairs of the country. And Jolene has actually done quite a bit of research on genealogy as well, and she's given lectures on that, which I've been told have been extremely interesting. Now, without saying anything else, I'd like to welcome Dr. Bean.
Good afternoon. Nice to see so many of you here. A little frightening in a way, actually, so many of you. Yes, my PhD dissertation was based on women fighting for the right to vote. But I think as time has passed, I've become more interested in understanding the lives of ordinary women, women who made a difference in Bermuda. So I think most of us know something about the women's suffrage movement, but there are so many women out there that we don't know anything about. And the woman that I'm going to talk about today is one of those women. Her name is Margaret Seon Green. Does anybody, well, you don't have to answer me out loud, but if you went to Berkeley and you sang that school song, then you might know that she was the one who wrote that, she was actually the one who wrote that school song. So, little has been written about Margaret Seon Green, even though she was very, very active in Bermuda's community, in the black community in the 1920s and 30s. She had a lifelong association with the Berkeley School song, and as I said before, she was the one who wrote that song. But if you go to the Berkeley School website, the only thing I found there is that bit of information that she was the author of the Berkeley School song. But if you examine her life, she did a lot more than just write that song. Nellie Mawson wrote about Margaret Seon Green in her book called Mind the Onion Seed. She described Margaret Seon Green as a writer in Bermuda's Black Renaissance movement, which would be similar to the Harlem Renaissance movement. She also wrote about Margaret Seon Green as an educator. If you look at Carol Hill's book, Rays of Hope, she also mentioned Margaret Seon Green as one of the individuals who was involved in the Sunshine League. But it was really Nellie Mawson's book that prompted my interest in Margaret Seon Green. And that was some 17 years ago that I did research on this woman, but I just never did anything with it. So what you're going to hear today is the research that I did way back then, but I've actually put it together to present it to you. And what I've concluded is that Margaret Seon Green was very aware of Bermuda's social and political inequalities, and she used her skills as a teacher, a writer, and as a community activist to instill pride and dignity in black people, and this is way back in the 1920s and 30s. I've used a variety of sources. When you get a woman that hasn't done a whole lot or hasn't been written about in any detail, it can become a real challenge to try and find information about her. So I had to do a lot of scouting around. I found people that knew her as a teacher, they were her students. I found people who were her neighbors, or at least one woman who was her neighbor. I found people who taught with her. I also found information in the Barclayite, which was a publication put out by the Berkeley Institute. I found her father's will. In her father's will, I found information about Margaret Seon Green. And I found her transcripts from college abroad. So it was this variety of information that I was able to pull together and tell you a little bit about this woman. So I'm going to start off with a little bit about her life, and then I'm going to end her schooling. Do you hear an echo or something? Yeah, I do too. Yeah, it sounds terrible, doesn't it? Sounds terrible. I'll see what they come so that he can help us out here. And then I'm going to talk about her as a teacher, as a poet, and as a social activist, so that you can see the kind of a role that she played in our history. And remember, she was an ordinary woman. She's not included in Bermuda's 400. Margaret Seon Green was born, she was a black woman born in Bermuda in December 1903 in Pembroke. Her parents were William and Annie Seon. She attended North Village School under Rufus Stovall, and then she went on to attend the Berkeley Institute under the tutelage of George A. DaCosta. When she was only 16 years old, she graduated from the Berkeley Institute. She passed her Cambridge senior exams, and she received a prize from the governor for her outstanding work. Because she was only 16, her parents thought that she was too young to go abroad to school, so she remained here in Bermuda for a few years, and she became a student teacher at the Berkeley Preparatory School. I'll tell you a little bit more about that later on. She attended the normal school. When she did go off to school, she attended this long name, the Normal Training School for Teachers in Hamilton, Ontario. It was a teacher's training school, teacher's training college, or it became a teacher's training college later on, but at this point it was called by this name. The first time I saw this, I thought, normal school, was she like a little abnormal, like what's going on here? But that was the label that they gave to teacher training schools way back then. Once she finished her year program, it was only a year's program, she went on, she must have done very well because she was invited to teach abroad. So her first official job as a teacher was in Northern Canada. And while she was in Canada during this 2-year period, she stayed in Canada as a teacher for 2 years. And while she was a teacher there, in her second year, she enrolled as an extramural student, something like a distance education student. She enrolled as an extramural student at Queen's University. And I called Queen's University, again, many, many years ago, and they sent me quite a bit of information on Margaret Seon Green. And when I look at her transcripts, I think it must have been kind of difficult initially for her to be teaching in Northern Canada, being homesick, and trying to study as well. So initially it was a little difficult for her, and you can see that it was reflected in her grades. She didn't do very, very well in those early years because I think she was homesick and because life in Canada was so very different from her life in Bermuda. So once she did her 2-year stint in Canada, she returned home to Bermuda and ended up teaching at the Berkeley Institute. It wasn't shortly after she arrived back in Bermuda that she met this man, Hilton Green, C. Hilton Green. He was a realtor living in Boston. I think he must have been Bermudian because when I look at the records later on, I see where this man is back here in Bermuda. So I'm assuming that he was a Bermudian living in Boston. So she marries this man and she goes off to live with him in Boston. But because she's so gung-ho about education, even in Boston, she enrolls in the Boston Clerical College. Again, continuing on with her education. She has her first degree by this time, but she's still interested in education. And according to an interview that I had with Lady Richards, the former Lady Richards, the late Lady Richards, she said that Margaret Seon Green planned to come back to Bermuda and teach commercial subjects to black girls. So this program that she was involved with was a 2-year program, and unfortunately she died in 1940 in Boston soon after she completed the program. So she never got the chance to come back to Bermuda. So I'm going to look now at all of the things that she did that contributed to Bermudian society. She devoted her entire life to teaching, and even as a child, even as a small child, she wanted to be a teacher. In a eulogy published in the Barclayite in 1940, F.S. Furbert described Seon Green as a born teacher. And he quoted lines from one of her poems. And this is her poem. The pride of India tree, neath whose shade I taught my school, at the most mature age of 10, and corrected with a rule, my pupils, so many, just 3, whom I taught their ABC, at my table of importance, beneath this before-named tree. I'm going to be quoting a few of her poems because I think they tell her life, and I'd like for you to hear her words through her poetry. Seon's dream of becoming a teacher never wavered, and while she was a student at the Berkeley Institute, she often helped other students. Her good friend, the late Louisa Gardner Richards, said in an interview that Margaret Seon Green always spent her lunch hours helping other students. In fact, Vernon Jackson, who was a junior at the Berkeley Institute at the time, was one of Margaret Seon Green's teachers. So she just seemed to have embraced the idea of helping other people through her teaching. Seon Green was a student teacher at the Berkeley Institute. Remember I said that after she graduated, 16 years old. So she's now a student teacher at the Berkeley Preparatory School. And even at this very early stage, we can begin to recognize that she understood the importance of young black children understanding who they were. So even at this stage, she began to instill pride and dignity in the black children that she was teaching, even as a student teacher. I interviewed the late Edith Wares Ming. This would be Henry Ming's and his sister. This would be their mother. I interviewed her as a senior many, many years ago, and she clearly remembered that when she was 8 years old, Margaret Seon Green was one of her teachers. And she recalled Miss Seon putting on a play based on life in old Bermuda. And in one of the scenes, the girls had to dress up in old-fashioned clothes, and she remembers wearing her auntie's old dress. In another scene, it was focused on a quilt party, and I didn't even know that we had quilt parties in Bermuda. The boys and girls sang in a chorus. So Ms. Ming couldn't remember any of the details of the play, but I think the fact remains that Margaret Seon Green had a lasting impression on this young Edith Wares Ming, because it's apparent that she cherished this memory of dressing up in her aunt's old clothes and singing at this quilt party. As previously stated, Margaret Seon Green spent 2 years in England before she returned home to Bermuda. And at the time, so by the time she came back to Bermuda, she was already enrolled in the Queen's University program. She'd done a year at the Queen's University program. So when she came back to Bermuda, and believe it or not, her program took her 10 years to complete. So 9 more years she had to go on that. So she's back in Bermuda now as a teacher at the Berkeley Institute. She's studying as an extramural student at Queen's University. She's teaching school. She's writing poetry. She's writing a family newspaper called The Islander. She's participating in the little theater group, and she's working with the Sunshine Lake. So she's really very, very busy. And in a poem called Carpe Diem, she says, "Use each moment as it's given. Fill it full with what's worthwhile. Do not cast aside enjoyment, but meet work with gladsome smile." While she was at Berkeley, 2 of her students, one still alive today, and the other, Lady Madrie Richards, these 2 ladies, Lady Madrie Richards and Dalton Tucker, had memories of Margaret Seon Green. Lady Richards knew her as a student. In fact, I have a picture of Lady Richards sitting on a bench with other students with Margaret Seon Green in the center as her teacher. Margaret Seon Green looked like one of the students. She looked so very young. And also, Lady Richards later on became a very good friend of Margaret Seon Green, but at this point, she's just her student. And she said that she remembered Seon Green teaching English and physical education. Ms. Tucker didn't remember very much about Margaret Seon Green, except that she remembers once that she reprimanded her for something she did. And she said that Margaret Seon Green had a very soft, quiet voice, but she got across her message. Both these women, Tucker and Richards, remember that Margaret Seon Green wrote some of the school yells or some of the jingles for Sports Day. But Margaret Seon Green didn't just do that. As I said before, she also wrote the Berkeley School song. We are the men of the years to come. I was going to sing it, but I have a terrible voice. We are the women of the future. What will become of our island home without our nurture? For we have, if you remember it, please say it. For we have the brain and the brawn and the blood of those who handed us the torch of life. And we pray that we'll aspire, emulate our worthy sires, and be heroes in the strife. So through the Berkeley School song, she reminds students, past students, those of you who just helped me out here, and present students of their loyalty to their alma mater and their responsibility to the Bermudian community. Margaret Seon Green's message of pride, dignity, and responsibility weren't just aimed at her students, they were also aimed at the larger community. In her poems, she sang the praises of local heroes and also reminded us of our responsibility as Black Bermudians. In one of her poems called Our Heroines, Seon writes, and she calls by name, "Ah, Irene, thou hast done a noble job. Thou hast done a noble deed to risk thy life to save young Alfie Can, has given an example that we need to stop at naught to help our fellow men. And little Sylvia, I did not forget, bright and alert to give the first alarm, instead of standing uselessly to fret, ran for assistance, sending out the harm." In another poem called A True Story, Seon Green writes about a 12-year-old girl who saved her 3 younger siblings from burning to death in a fire. And in The Catastrophe, she writes about an explosion aboard the SS Corona and honors the memory of those who lost their lives. Seon Green's other poems also reminded us of our responsibilities as Black Bermudians. The Negro Slave's Return, for example, narrates the story of a slave returning to the island on the 100th anniversary of the abolition of slavery. And the slave initially looks around and is really proud of what he sees. He thinks that Black Bermudians are doing very well. But when the slave takes a closer look, he's very disappointed, and he says, "With the advantage they have, I see, my people make no effort to be free, free from straining bonds and free from vice and from the obnoxious fangs of prejudice." So she's taking real life situations and putting them in her poetry. In addition to teaching and doing this poetry, Margaret Seon Green was also a community activist. And in a poem called Reclaimed, Seon Green tells a story about the founder of the Sunshine League, Agnes May Robinson, and her child rescue program. The main character in this poem is a young boy with an attitude living neath number 3 wharf in Hamilton. I think they call them wharf rats,
Yes,
the kids who lived
yes.
under the wharfs.
Sometimes dock rats.
Sometimes dock rats, horrible names. So one of her poems called Reclaimed. "For by his side a lady stands, motherly kindness in her eyes. His ire is quenched, he turns to go, but turns again in great surprise. The lady speaks. 'My boy,' she says, 'would you not like to come with me?' 'Come with you,' the lad replied. 'Tell me, miss, who may you be?' 'If you've heard of the Sunshine League, you've heard of me,' was the reply. 'I seek out just such boys as you who wish from misery to fly.'" By addressing Bermuda's social issues in her poetry, Margaret Seon Green is drawing attention to those who are less fortunate, and she's also appealing to the Bermudian community, the Black Bermudian community, to help out where they can. So the question arises, why was she so drawn to helping others? One could argue that it was just her nature, but I think it was more than that. Margaret Seon Green had excellent role models. She wrote about them in her poetry. Her father, for example, in one of her poems, he was a storekeeper, and he often gave advice to young men and older men who came to his shop. Her aunt Mary was a nurse at the cottage hospital, and she dedicated her life to helping others. Her teachers, as well as the people in the community, were all her role models, and she spoke about these in her poems. It is likely that Margaret Seon Green was also influenced by Marcus Garvey, because this was the time of the Garveyite movement. And although I don't find any evidence of her having been a member of the movement, his message of unity, pride, and dignity amongst the black race is very evident in her poems. Her themes speak about the same thing. In fact, many of Margaret Seon Green's poems send a message to the black people of Bermuda to help themselves, help others, work towards a unified race, learn from others, and revere your local role models or your local heroes. It's also likely that Margaret Seon Green was influenced by Paul Laurence Dunbar. He was a black American, late 19th, early 20th century. And she writes about him in one of her poems called Tribute. His people's joys, his people's woes, he painted with his living pen, and such a lively kind he chose, a healing balm to many then. Even though these words were written to honor Paul Laurence Dunbar, we can take those very same words, and rather than say he did this and he did that, we can take the same words and say she did this. So I'm going to read that poem again, but I'm going to replace he with she, and then I'm going to just add a second verse to that. So I'm looking at Margaret Seon in a similar light that she was looking at Paul Laurence Dunbar. Her people's joys, her people's woes, she painted with her living pen, and such a kindly way she chose, a healing balm to many then. And to us as we peruse those works that show a soul was great, its kindly balm does not refuse to reconcile us to our fate. And that's the end of my presentation.
Thank you very much, Jolene. That was really interesting. There was a group over there who they were repeating what you were. Was it the Barclay song? They've got fantastic memories because I heard them. Well done. All right? But don't repeat anything I say. All right? Okay. Now I'm going to move. There's still some food over there. I checked that, when I left here because it was being depleted. I grabbed a few others. Anyway, the next bold and beautiful woman is Meredith Ebbin. And I would just like to say a few things about Meredith. I've known her for quite a time. And you probably know that she's a veteran Bermuda journalist. And she's now a freelance writer. Earlier history, not too long ago. She began her career as a journalist for the Royal Gazette. And she also wrote articles for the Mid-Ocean News and worked for several years as a journalist for the Bermuda Sun. She also served as the managing editor for the Bermudian magazine. This is interesting. She was founder and the editor of Bermuda Biographies .bm website, which focuses on the biographical background of outstanding Bermudians. I'm sure that most of you are familiar with the publication of Bermuda 1609-2009, that's the 400 years, Bermuda Portraits. You're all familiar with that, aren't you? Put up your hands if you are. Right, well done. Some aren't. Okay, that's all right. Right. Now, I was on that committee, and Meredith was, of course, too. But who put the book together? That was Meredith. She did a fantastic job. It was really, she did a lot of work, and she had to meet a deadline. She met that deadline, which I thought was fantastic. Right. Yeah, it was fantastic. She spent a lot of time, and I'd like to congratulate. I've congratulated her before, but I congratulate her again. Well done, Meredith. And Meredith, would you like to come up here now?
I didn't realize Willowbank was so far away. Well, I'm going to speak today about the wives of two prominent Bermudian men. Julia Place, she was the wife of Alfred Brownlow Place. He was the longtime publisher of the Bermuda Recorder. And the other woman is Clara Christian Gordon. She was the wife of Dr. E.F. Gordon. I think most people know who they are, but for those who don't know, Dr. Gordon is considered one of the two most important figures of 20th century Bermuda because of his activism, most notably as president of the Bermuda Workers Association. A.B. Place, as he was known, was co-founder and publisher of the Bermuda Recorder. Now, I believe that neither A.B. Place nor E.F. Gordon would have achieved their place in Bermuda's history without the contribution that they received from their wives. Now, when Julia Place died in 1977 at the age of 80, she merited just a few paragraphs on page 2 of the Royal Gazette. But she was described as the backbone of the Recorder. She was his inspiration and the backbone of the place. She went to work daily with her husband. Now, the quote was unattributed, and the story just trailed off. But I think the point was made. Julia Louise Place was born in Somerset in 1874. Her maiden name was Tucker. Her mother died when she was a girl, and she was raised by her aunt. I don't know where she went to school. Her daughter, Rhoda Burrows, couldn't recall either, but it is likely that she had only a primary school education, which was typical for the period, despite the accomplishments of people like Margaret, Seon, Seon Green. I think it was most people left school at the primary level. But when I ask friends who are still alive today about Julia Place, they remember a woman who was very well read, she was a very fluent speaker, and she was keenly interested in political affairs. She was not afraid to speak her mind either. Apparently, she even stood up to Dr. Gordon. She was a teenager when she married A.B. Place, and the couple had 6 children, 4 of whom survived to adulthood. Now, the Places lived in a segregated, strictly controlled world. A.B. Place was a printer who learned his trade at the Colonist Daily, and that was a newspaper that was absorbed by the Royal Gazette at some point. But that's where he started out. Now, A.B. Place was inspired by Marcus Garvey, and we've heard his name already today, but he was the Jamaican-born Black nationalist who had a major influence during his life. But Ira Phillip writes in his book From Monk to Mzumbo that Mr. Place was